You're tuned in to 92.1 WOMR FM Provincetown and 91.3 WFMR FM Orleans, the voice and spirit of Cape Cod. I bid you welcome to another episode of Healing Wisdom. I'm your host, Pandora People's chartered herbalist and psychic medium. Healing Wisdom explores mind, body, soul connections as we discuss the healing effects of the arts, metaphysical concepts, intuition, and the spiritual aspects of everyday living. Healing Wisdom begins in the heart. Our theme music is provided by Mystic Pete. Hello, Cape Cod and beyond. My guest today is author and journalist Alex Kotlowitz, who will be in conversation with former New York Magazine's editor Adam Moss at 7 p.m. at the Hawthorne Barn as part of the 20 Summers series in Provincetown, where he will be discussing his latest work, An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago. His other books include There Are No Children Here, The Other Side of the River, and Chicago, Never a City So Real. Welcome, Alex. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. So when did you start looking into issues of race and poverty in this country? I think a lot of white people avoid getting in on the discussion, and as a journalist, everyone has a particular mission to reveal certain truths. So how did you come to this path?
Yeah, it was during the Reagan years. I mean, at a time when we had an administration that had completely turned its head away from the cities. And I was actually a staff writer at the Wall Street Journal writing about urban affairs and social issues. And I began to spend some time in a public housing project on the west side of Chicago. And I got to say, I mean, I was just so distressed by the conditions there. I had just never, I mean, I thought I was pretty savvy when it came to the poverty in our cities. I had just never seen anything quite like it. And I was really unnerved and unsettled by the violence in that community. And I remember initially feeling this incredible sense of shame. Like, how is it I could not know? In fact, the projects I was spending time with, which ultimately were the subject of my first book, There Are No Children Here, they were just a couple of miles from my then office downtown. And then that shame, ultimately just turned into this sense of anger, this sense of indignant fury. Like, how is it that people can live in such conditions in what is the world's most prosperous country?
Your documentary, The Interrupters, a collaboration with Steve James, premiered at the Sundance in January of 2011 and aired as a 2-hour special on PBS's Frontline. The film features the work of Ceasefire, an initiative of the Chicago Project for Violence Prevention. It really sounds like quite a journey. Can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. So Steve's a longtime friend, and we've been trying to think of something to do together. And I had done a cover story about the organization for the New York Times Magazine, and was really kind of taken not so much with the organization, but with the individuals who work there. These were, men and actually a handful of women who were formerly of the street, who were now in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and who were kind of a testament to the notion that people have a second act in their lives. These were people who all were trying to, in some manner or another, undo some of the damage that they had helped cause years earlier. And their job, as their job title suggests, is they would go out and interrupt disputes before they erupted into something more. And so we spent 14 months with 3 of the interrupters as they went about their work, as they spent time in their communities. So both chronicling what they did in the neighborhoods and also chronicling their own lives, their own journeys, which in and of themselves were remarkable. It sort of, I think, what was interesting to me is that each of these people, a couple of them had served time in prison. One of them had served time in prison for murder. And not only did they have second acts in life, but I think, they had come to a place where it would be kind of glib to say they had changed. I think really what it is they came to sort of discover who they really were.
Right. Absolutely. Well, one of the things that comes to mind is that I spoke with author Dr. Ed Tick, and he's a psychologist who works with PTSD, and he founded Soldier's Heart, and he talks about how there are many cultures where people don't suffer from PTSD after going to war, and certain people do and certain people don't. And he sees homecoming and mentorship as ways to heal this combat fatigue syndrome,
Right.
but I think it's still really applicable to many people in their lives, especially people who live in poverty. And are surrounded by gang violence.
Right.
So it seems to me that these people who are intervening in violence are really offering that sort of embrace of mentorship and a new way of being.
Right, they are, but I will tell you, I mean, interestingly enough, I think what we saw also in some of the interrupters that we spent time with was the trauma that you just described, undiagnosed, but, people who, had trouble sleeping, who trouble concentrating, who, kept busy all the time to keep these memories at bay. And there's no question that their mentorship certainly helped others. I mean, for me, one of the most exciting things that's going on now in the world of violence prevention is this effort to deal with that trauma that you speak of, that we certainly have seen in soldiers coming back from combat. And it's really, in the end, sort of the essence of my book, without speaking about it directly, but it's about how the violence gets in your bones, how it comes to shape you, and how you work really hard not to let it define you.
In 2016, you worked with inmates at the Illinois Stateville prison on essays about their cells. The stories which ran on the New Yorker's radio hour became the basis for the podcast Written Inside. What inspired you to help get these stories told?
Yeah, I love that experience. So I had been invited to come give just a workshop at Stateville. It's a maximum security prison about an hour south of Chicago on storytelling. And so I had about a dozen guys in the class, and I had them do an exercise to take 15 minutes and just describe their prison cells. And they read them aloud in class. And I was so taken with what I heard, I offered to work with them and try to refine them. So I spent what turned out to be 8 months working with them from draft to draft to draft. And they were these really beautiful essays. I mean, initially, I will be perfectly frank, a couple of the inmates kind of balked. I mean, they really wanted to write about their cases, and they wanted to write about the miserable conditions in prison. And I wanted them to write about their prison cell for two reasons. One is I really wanted to sort of teach them, give them the tools to tell stories. But I also felt like it would give them some sense of humanity, and they could write about things that surprised people. I mean, one of the inmates wrote about teaching himself to play the piano, and he built himself a cardboard piano that he would sit on his bunk in his cell and play that cardboard piano, and he could hear the music in his head, and he became a really, really fine pianist. He had access to a piano just on Sundays, and so he could go every Sunday and try what he had learned. There's another beautiful story about a guy who was a recluse, and it's about being a recluse in prison, about spending all your time in your prison cell. And one of the essays that I really loved is a story about a guy, Howard, who must have weighed about 250 pounds, and he writes about coming back to his prison cell, and he sees a bird on the bars of his cell, and he's just really taken with it. It just gives him this moment of joy, and the bird takes off and goes under his bunk bed, and this 250-pound guy gets on the floor, tries to flush the bird out and get him out. And he wrote this piece, and I kept on saying to Howard, so what about this moment has stayed with you? And I remember he first wrote about how the bird represented freedom, and I said, oh, come on, I don't believe that bull. And it turns out that the incident, this small moment, had happened 10 years earlier, and he had held on to it. And it just spoke, I think, volumes about how difficult it is to find even these small moments of joy in prison. So it was a remarkable experience, and it also, for me, one of the things I loved about it was being able to help these guys find their own voices.
Yeah. Well, I think creativity leads to alternative ways of thinking and feeling and expressing ourselves, and it really changes and alters people. It's really part of
it does. I mean, it made them feel really, I just remember, it was hard to have contact with them, but I'd get letters from them and occasionally a phone call, and it just made them feel so good. One of them, their mother had passed out his essay in church. It just gave them them a sense of being. I love that experience. In fact, I'm going back to Stateville in January to teach a class, not to the same guys, but I was just so taken with that experience that I really wanted to get back in there.
So you received high praise for your latest work, An American Summer Love and Death in Chicago, which you'll be discussing at length with magazine and newspaper editor Adam Moss, May 25th at the Hawthorne Barn in Provincetown as part of the 20 Summer Series. So in your words, just briefly, what's this story about?
First of all, I can't wait for the event. I'm so honored to be doing this with Adam, who I just deeply admire as an editor. In fact, I did some writing for him when he was at the New York Times magazine. So my book is a collection of stories from one summer in Chicago about people emerging from the violence and trying to reckon with it. And they're stories that, for me at least, upended what I thought I knew. These are stories that knocked me off balance, that surprised me in one manner or another. Some of the stories course through the entire summer. Some of them are self-contained. But there are these deeply intimate tales of people in all their complexity and richness and fullness, trying to wrestle with this moment in their lives that was just the most painful and sorrowful moment that they've experienced, and trying to emerge from it. And it's a story that is both filled with sorrow, but also filled with an incredible amount of hope. And as the subtitle suggests, and I didn't realize this until I sat down to write these stories, that you can't talk about death without celebrating life, without writing about love. And that's what these stories are about.
Your wife, Maria Woltjen, directs the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights, helping unaccompanied children through policies, advocacy, and reform. With recent revelations that immigrant children in the thousands have seemingly disappeared and that children in orphanages are often unaccounted for and vulnerable to human trafficking, it seems like particularly important work. I would just love for you to speak a little bit about it.
Oh, my wife is my hero. She's got a long background in civil rights work, and about 13 years ago, she founded the Young Center. She was the only person working there. At the time, there were, I think 3,500 children who would get smuggled into this country, sometimes over the border, sometimes by airplane, and get picked up by immigration and detained by Department of Homeland Security. And so the thing about kids in detention who have been smuggled here, there's no best interest standard as there is in domestic courts. And so she began this organization that goes and spends time with these kids and tries to figure out ultimately what's in their best interest. There are now upwards of 60,000 kids come over the border by themselves every year and picked up by Department of Homeland Security. My wife's organization now has grown. She's got 65 people working there at 8 sites around the country, including on the border. And they, as you alluded to, the past couple of years has just been a steady movement from crisis to crisis, especially when we saw the policy by the Trump administration to separate children from their families. And so the people who in the Young Center, lawyers and social workers, they go into these shelters, they spend time with these kids, they try to unravel and understand their stories and try to figure out ultimately what's in the best interest. Is it to stay here with a family member, maybe a parent, maybe an aunt or uncle? Is it to go back to their country? That happens on occasion. But they will go to court, and they are the most rigorous, loyal defenders of these children. In fact, the story I always love to tell is that they once had an ICE agent come up to one of the lawyers who works at the Young Center after a case and just said, "If my son ever gets in trouble, I want you on their side."
That's excellent. Well, thank you so much, Alex Kotlowitz, for joining us this morning on Healing Wisdom. We're looking forward to seeing you at 20 Summers, May 25th, in conversation with Adam Moss.
Well, thanks, Pandora. Thanks for having me on. I can't wait to get out there.
You've been listening to Healing Wisdom. I'm your host, Pandora Peoples, certified chartered herbalist and psychic medium. You can find Healing Wisdom podcasts at WOMR.org. Contact me with any feedback, questions, or show ideas at peachypandora@yahoo.com. A big thanks to the Wizard of Operations, Matthew Dunn. Join me again next week.